In the context of the corona crisis, the case of Adidas has received particular attention by the general public and media. The world's second largest sports manufacturer had record profits of 2 billion euros in the last year, as well as record sales of 24 billion. Now in the beginning of 2020, in the context of the corona crisis, this very profitable company had to ask very quickly for rent deferrals and finally had to apply for state loans. How could that happen? First of all, profitability is not equal to liquidity. Profitability is the result of revenues and expenses, while liquidity is the outcome of cash inflows and cash outflows. For profitability, you look into the income statement, while for liquidity, you look, for example, at the relationship between current assets and current liabilities in the balance sheet, or you look into the cash flow statement. Unfortunately, investors mainly focus on the income statement. Why is that? Well, because as a shareholder, you receive parts of the profits in the form of dividends. That is why management is always under pressure to generate profitability growth. And in this regard, management always thinks that it's not a good idea to accumulate cash, because cash should always be invested in order to generate these profits. In addition, the central banks have pushed a lot of money into the markets and interest rates are very low. That is why management always believes that it is easy to get cash from the outside. Now, in the corona crisis, it has shown that this was a misbelief. Could we have predicted that Adidas may run into a liquidity problem? Usually, you can calculate two key financial metrics in order to assess the liquidity of companies. The first one is the well-known current ratio. It's the relationship between current assets and current liabilities. Let us take a look at the annual report of Adidas in the year 2019. There you can see that current assets amount to 11 billion euros, while at the same time current liabilities are at around 9 billion euros. So the current ratio is obviously above 1, which is a good result because that signals that current assets are there in order to cover all current liabilities. What about the second ratio, the cash ratio? The cash ratio is a stricter ratio because it now makes a relationship between cash on hand and current liabilities. So in comparison to the current ratio, it ignores accounts receivables and inventories. That is because inventories and accounts receivable need some time in order to be turned into cash. So customers need to pay their bills and we need some time in order to sell inventory. And especially in the times of the corona crisis, it may be better to take a look at the cash ratio because this is exactly what happens. Customers may not be able to pay their bills and we may not be able to sell our inventories. So let us determine the cash ratio for Adidas. You can see that the current cash balance of Adidas is at 2.2 billion euros. In comparison to the overall current liabilities, this is just 25% of the current liabilities. So it's far below 1. And to make it even worse, let's take a look within the current liabilities at the accounts payable, so the outstanding bills of Adidas with regard to suppliers. You can see that the accounts payable at the end of 2019 have been at 2.7 billion. Now you compare this with the cash and cash equivalents at the year end, which is 2.2 billion. There you can see that there is a lack of 500 million euros. So obviously there have been already some liquidity problems for Adidas before the corona crisis even started. Is Adidas the only company that shows this pattern? I have looked at the annual reports of the DAX 30 companies over the last 10 years. With regard to the current ratio, the DAX 30 companies seem to set an example, because the current ratio over the last 10 years on average was always above this magic threshold of 1. What about the cash ratio? The cash ratio shows a completely different pattern. The average value of the cash ratio over the last 10 years is at 0.24. And in 2019, it was just 0.19. So in other words, only 19% of current liabilities have been covered by cash. So obviously the German companies, the large German companies, have not used the very profitable past 10 years in order to build up liquidity reserves, probably because they always wanted to use the liquidity in order to generate profits. But now the corona crisis is demonstrating that profits of the past do not pay current bills. In other words, cash is king. So the current corona crisis reveals a devastating lack of liquidity planning. Liquidity planning in general wants to ensure that there is enough liquidity available in order to handle all future potential cash outflows. This also usually encompasses that you consider worst-case scenarios, like a crisis that we observe right now. What is the consequence if you have a lack of liquidity planning? Well, mainly you have to take loans that you would not take otherwise. And if you take loans, this increases the leverage of the company and the financial burden in the future, because you have to pay for the interest rates and the installments. And as a consequence of that, normally companies have to downsize their future investment plans. But interestingly, the lack of liquidity planning is not only bad for the finances of the company. It's also bad for the marketing and the relationship to your customers. Adidas has shown this. So when Adidas announced that they want to defer rent payments, there was a very negative feedback by media and the general public. There were hashtags like boycott Adidas that went viral. And for a company like Adidas, this is a very negative result, because for Adidas, the brand image and reputation is a key success driver. So what companies should always take into account is that poor liquidity planning is not only bad for financing, it's also very bad for marketing and public relations. Of course, for some industries like the aviation industry or the hotel industry, it is more or less unfeasible to prepare for such a worst-case scenario where more or less all sales dry up in an instant. However, for a company like Adidas, where there are still sales, for example by online channels, there is of course still a possibility to have a good liquidity planning. So in general, if you look at all companies, I've analyzed this 0.19, the cash ratio. My clear recommendation is that companies should really aim for improving the cash ratio, moving it closer to the threshold of 1. How could that be done? For example, by putting more weight to the treasurer in companies, by making a more active receivable management, by looking at more into sales and leaseback options. So a good liquidity planning is not only something for a crisis, it should really be seen as a very proactive, strategic and long-term instrument for the well-being of the company.